They thought he'd come to inspire, but what Barron Trump tried on that stage wasn't leadership, it was humiliation, aimed at a woman who'd fought her way from courtroom trenches to the halls of Congress. But in less than 5 minutes, Jasmine Crockett turned the tables so brutally, so brilliantly, the audience sat frozen in their chairs. This wasn't just a debate, it became a reckoning. If you believe real leadership is earned, not inherited, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to witness will shake you. A battle of arrogance versus authenticity, of media polish versus lived experience. And by the time Jasmine dropped her final line, even Barron didn't know how to look the camera in the eye. They dressed it up like a national debate on ethics and leadership, but what it became, no one could have predicted. In a grand auditorium soaked in blue light and polished wood, under chandeliers that gleamed like power itself, 2 podiums stood at opposite ends of the stage, one draped in sleek gold trim, elevated half an inch higher than the other, framed like a throne for the next generation of conservative royalty. The other, plain, functional, built to serve, not to shine. And standing at those podiums, 2 lives stared across a canyon of class, legacy, and lived pain. Barron Trump, the son of a president, walked onto that stage like he was stepping into a birthright. Tall, polished, with every hair in place and every camera knowing his angles, he smiled like he had something to prove, and everything to lose. His team had been preparing him for this moment, not for weeks, but for years. Notebooks filled with statistics, clipboards brimming with talking points, prep rooms lined with political consultants who had served his father. His stride was the kind that comes from never having to fight to be heard. And yet, deep beneath the tailored suit and trademark smirk, something flickered, a quiet panic that no amount of practice could quiet. Because this time, the cameras were live, and across from him stood something his team hadn't trained him for, a woman who knew what it meant to bleed for her place in the room. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett wasn't supposed to be here, not in their eyes. A black woman from Texas, a former public defender who juggled salon jobs to stay in school and slept 4 hours a night to keep the lights on. She didn't come from legacy. She didn't inherit a platform. She built one, from court dockets and eviction notices, from whispered prayers in hospital waiting rooms, from the echo of her own mother's voice, reminding her that silence was not survival. And tonight, with a deep navy blazer stretched across her shoulders and her chin held high, she didn't walk onto that stage to perform. She came to reveal. The moderator, a seasoned journalist named Lyle Hartman, tried to mask the tension. He welcomed the crowd with rehearsed charm, speaking of dialogue and democracy, of a forum for the future. But no one was fooled. The room wasn't there for conversation. They were here for conflict. They wanted fire. And it didn't take long. The first question came easy. What does ethical leadership mean today? Hartman offered it to Barron first with a slight nod, perhaps out of courtesy, perhaps out of habit. Barron didn't miss a beat. He leaned into the mic, his voice calm, rehearsed. Before we talk about what leadership should look like, he said, eyes sliding sideways toward Jasmine, maybe we should ask what it currently looks like. Then came the line his team had built everything around. Because I'm fascinated truly by how someone goes from a hair salon chair to the House floor. Congresswoman Crockett, how does that happen? He delivered it like a punchline, not loud, not cruel, just smooth enough to be called polite, just sharp enough to land like an insult. The crowd gasped, some smiled nervously, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Jasmine didn't move, not a twitch, not a blink. Her hands rested calmly atop the podium, her eyes locked not on Barron, but on the audience. And when she finally spoke, it was not a reaction, it was a reckoning. How does it happen? She said, repeating the question slowly, as though unwrapping an old wound she knew well. Her voice was even, measured. It happens when a girl works 3 jobs and still can't afford her textbooks. It happens when she studies on lunch breaks, takes buses to courthouses, and sits in back rows where no one expects her to speak, let alone lead. Her eyes flicked to him now, steady and still. It happens when a woman shows up every day in rooms designed to reject her and refuses to leave. A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. Not applause, but something deeper. Recognition. Barron shifted, just slightly. But it was enough to let the crowd know he had miscalculated. His smirk faltered. His confidence, that golden armor of privilege and preparation, had been cracked. And Jasmine? She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She didn't need to. She just stood there, breathing, present, real. And in that moment, the air in the auditorium changed. Because this wasn't just about him. It wasn't even about her. It was about every teacher who'd bought their own supplies. Every mother who'd waited tables and wiped tears in the same shift. Every veteran turned away from the VA. Every kid told their voice didn't matter. Jasmine wasn't just answering a question. She was answering them. Behind the curtain, Barron's team watched in silence. Their golden boy, their carefully curated prince of conservative rebranding, had made his opening move and lost the room. But they hadn't planned for this kind of opponent. Jasmine wasn't playing a game. She was telling the truth. And truth, no matter how quietly spoken, cuts deeper than any applause line. The moderator cleared his throat, unsure whether to move on or stay in the moment, but Jasmine wasn't finished. You asked how it happens? I'll tell you how. It happens when the people you're supposed to forget won't let you. When the communities you're told don't matter keep showing up anyway. When you realize your story is a weapon in a world that tries to erase you. That's how. A pause, not for effect, not for breath, for weight, for truth to land where it needed to. And somewhere in the back of the room, a Vietnam veteran with silver hair and a service pin on his lapel wiped his eye. Because what he had just seen wasn't politics. It was purpose. The moment Jasmine finished her last sentence, a long pause lingered in the air like a breath too sacred to exhale. The audience didn't clap right away. They didn't need to. Something had settled in the room, a heaviness born not of conflict, but of clarity. For a few heartbeats, even the cameras stood still, unsure whether to zoom in or pan out, because what had happened wasn't in the script. It was in the silence. And Barron felt it too. Not the shame he'd been taught to avoid, but something more dangerous, doubt. The kind of doubt that seeps in through cracks in confidence, the kind that asks, quietly and cruelly, what if she's right? And deep in his gut, he knew. This wasn't the crowd he walked in with. Jasmine hadn't just responded. She had redirected the entire current of the room, and now Barron was standing in waters he didn't know how to swim. Still, politics rewards persistence, and so he leaned in again, trying to find his footing with the weapon he'd been trained to wield. Data. I appreciate the Congresswoman's passion, he said, carefully drawing out the word as if it were a flaw to be managed. But when it comes to leadership, emotions don't pay the bills. Results do. He reached down and lifted a packet of statistics from beneath his podium, highlighted, bound, curated like a courtroom exhibit. Under her watch, high school graduation rates in District 30 have declined. Public safety response times have increased. Budget deficits have widened. As he listed off the figures, a graph appeared on the screen behind them, clean and bold, dipped in red and green bars that danced like proof. He gestured to it smugly, as if to say, "This is leadership, reduced to lines and percentages." "We cannot afford to govern from the heart," he continued. "We have to govern from the head. And no matter how compelling the story, metrics don't lie." But Jasmine didn't take the bait. She didn't scramble for her notes or fumble through a response. She waited. Waited until the crowd finished reading those graphs. Waited until Barron's voice lost its luster. Then, with a voice as steady as still water, she spoke. "You're right, Mr. Trump. Metrics don't lie, but neither do mothers." The audience stirred. She stepped away from her podium now, closing the distance between herself and the crowd, not toward Barron, but toward the people. "Last month," she said, "I visited a public school in Oak Cliff. The principal pulled me aside. She was in tears. Not because of test scores, but because the ceiling in her cafeteria had collapsed the night before, and no one had come to inspect it." The crowd shifted. The mood thickened. "You can show me charts," Jasmine continued, "but I can show you classrooms where the teachers buy their own soap, clinics that shut their doors because the electricity bill couldn't be paid, grandmothers who raise their grandkids because the parent died waiting on affordable treatment. You want to measure leadership by budget sheets? Try looking those women in the eye." Her voice didn't rise. It dropped, lower, more intimate. And yet it carried through the auditorium like a prayer whispered in a cathedral. This is not emotion. This is accountability. This is what happens when policy becomes personal, when politics has a body count. She turned back to Barron then, but her eyes held no fire, just something heavier, pity. "You think because I speak with conviction that I'm angry. You think because I fight that I'm emotional, but that says more about you than me, because you're measuring leadership by volume, not by courage." Now the applause came. It wasn't loud, but it was deep, grounded, the kind that rises when something just feels right. Barron blinked. He glanced toward his notes again, but they felt different now, foreign, as if the ink had dried in another language. He tried one more pivot, reaching for the final card his team had told him to keep in his back pocket, policy betrayal. "Congresswoman, let's talk about transparency," he said. "You voted against the infrastructure expansion package that would have brought hundreds of jobs to your district. That's not fighting for the people. That's denying them opportunities." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, walked to the moderator's table, and politely asked for the document in question. They handed it over. She flipped directly to the cited clause, then lifted her eyes. "I didn't vote against it," she said. "I wrote the amendment that ensured those jobs couldn't be outsourced to firms that pay workers poverty wages. That's not obstruction. That's protection." Silence. Not because the crowd didn't understand, but because they did. Barron's jaw clenched. His fingers fidgeted at the podium, and Jasmine stepped back to hers, calm as ever. She looked out across the room, eyes resting on a woman in the front row, wearing a faded denim jacket and a badge from the Sanitation Workers Union. "Leadership," she said quietly, "isn't about speaking well. It's about listening better." And I listened to her. Not your lobbyists, not your donors, her. That woman stood up, quietly, slowly, tears welling in her eyes, and she clapped, just once, then another, until the room, every seat, every section, was on its feet. The moderator, clearly moved, looked down at his cards, then set them aside, because they weren't needed anymore. The debate was still on paper. But the room had already decided, and they weren't clapping for statistics. They were clapping for a woman who came not to argue, but to represent. A woman who came not for a title, but for the truth. As the applause began to fade, a different kind of silence fell over the room. Not awkward, not uncertain, but reverent, like the hush that fills a chapel after prayer. Barron Trump, still behind his podium, tried to summon something resembling authority, but his voice, when it returned, sounded thinner than before. His team, watching from the wings, exchanged quiet glances. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. The plan had been clean. Position him as the calm, articulate heir to a new political vision. Use Jasmine as contrast, but instead, she had become the compass. And Barron, he was drifting. Still, his instincts told him to fight. His fingers gripped the podium like a lifeline. "Congresswoman," he began, reaching for a voice that no longer held the same weight. "We can all agree that stories move people, but policy moves systems. We're not here to talk about emotion. We're here to talk about governance." The words echoed, but they didn't land, not like hers had. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She let him continue, even as he cited articles, quoted economists, and pointed to headlines printed just days before. But no one in the audience wrote down a word he said. No phones lifted, no pens moved. When he finished, there was no applause, just that same silence. And Jasmine, ever steady, stepped forward, not to rebut, but to reveal. "Do you know what I did the morning before I flew here?" she asked, her tone soft but sharp. "I sat with a mother who had to choose between paying for insulin or paying her electric bill. She didn't raise her voice, but every word pierced the air. Do you know what she said to me? She said, 'Congresswoman, I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of people calling me a statistic. I'm tired of politicians only showing up when the cameras are on.'" Jasmine looked around the room, and in that moment, it was as if she'd pulled every person in close. She's not a policy. She's not a headline. She's a woman trying to keep her son alive in a country that's forgotten how to listen. Barron swallowed hard. He turned a page in his notes, hoping to find footing. Jasmine gave him none. "You speak of systems," she said. "Let's talk about them. Let's talk about a system that gave you a microphone before you ever earned it. A system that trained you to believe presence is performance, that polished confidence is competence. But the people I serve, they don't care if you look the part. They care if you show up when it matters." A man in the back, a retired steelworker wearing a faded red cap, nodded slowly. He didn't clap. He didn't need to. The truth didn't require volume to resonate. "Let's talk about governance," Jasmine continued. "Let's talk about a bill that would have redirected funds from rural health clinics to corporate tax incentives. The same bill you just defended. You praised it, Mr. Trump. You held it up like it was salvation. But you didn't read the fine print. I did. I bled over that fine print." Barron tried to interject. "With all due respect." But Jasmine cut him off, not harshly, but with absolute clarity. "No, you don't get to use respect as a shield, not when you haven't earned it. Respect isn't about tone. It's about truth." The audience stirred again, their eyes shifting fully to her, their bodies leaning in. "I fought to strip that clause," she said. "I fought because I saw the clinics that were going to close, the children who wouldn't get seen, the elders who would die waiting. You want to talk governance? That's governance. It's not glamorous. It's not televised. It's policy meetings at 2 a.m. It's compromise that makes your stomach turn. It's choosing which community has to wait another year for a water system that won't poison them." Barron's hands had left his notes. They now rested limply on either side of his podium. His face, still composed, carried the tautness of someone trying to keep control of a room already lost. Jasmine let the silence grow again. Then she turned, not to him, but to the crowd. "I didn't come here to prove I belong. I came because I do belong. I came because a seat at the table means nothing if you're too afraid to speak truth into the room. And I will speak it, even when it shakes the walls." The moderator, Lyle Hartman, looked up, visibly moved. For the first time all night, he set his cue cards aside. Barron's team began to panic. One staffer leaned toward another and whispered, "He has to pivot. Pull the national security card. Anything." And Barron did. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, your focus on feelings while our country faces global threats is deeply concerning. China doesn't care about how we feel. Iran isn't interested in our emotions. We need strength, resolve, discipline." The words were strong. They were serious. But they rang hollow. Jasmine didn't flinch. "And what do you think strength is?" she asked. "Do you think it's yelling louder? Do you think it's sending troops without understanding the lives at stake? Strength is not detachment. It's presence. It's accountability. It's walking into a funeral for a boy shot by police and still having the strength to face his mother. It's negotiating with your opposition because lives, not legacies, are on the line." She stepped closer to the audience now, just one step, but it felt like an entire march. "Resolve," she echoed, "is burying your brother and still showing up to vote because your community needs a champion. Discipline? Discipline is staying up until 3 a.m., reading legislation line by line because no one else will." Barron's jaw moved, as if he was about to say something, but the words didn't come. His mouth closed again, his eyes dropped briefly, and in that flicker, in that momentary retreat, the audience saw the truth. He had underestimated her, and now he was behind. Jasmine walked back to her podium. She didn't look triumphant. She looked resolved. "I will not apologize for caring," she said. "I will not shrink because I make you uncomfortable. I don't come from a dynasty. I come from determination." The crowd, silent again, began to stir. A woman near the middle wiped a tear. A man beside her nodded, his arms crossed, his face unreadable but moved. "I don't govern for headlines," Jasmine continued. "I govern for the child whose mother prays each night that rent won't rise again. For the veteran who tapes his boots because his VA claim is still waiting. For the woman who walks 3 miles to a job that doesn't give her health insurance. That's who I'm here for." She paused, and then, as if inviting everyone into the truth of her words, she finished, "That's who I'll always be here for." The applause that followed didn't erupt. It rose, like something sacred, like something earned. Not because Jasmine had performed, but because she had delivered something rare, honesty. By the time the applause receded and the lights dimmed just slightly, the temperature of the room had changed. Not literally, but in energy. The oxygen itself seemed charged with something heavier than political rhetoric, something older. Jasmine Crockett had taken the stage and turned it into something it was never meant to be, a place of reckoning. She hadn't come to outshine Barron. She came to expose the very architecture that had built his podium higher, and now, for the first time all night, even the walls seemed to lean in. The moderator tried to resume his role with composure, but he found himself fumbling for the next card. He didn't need to look at Jasmine. She wasn't watching him anyway. She was watching the audience, specifically the older gentleman in the third row, wearing a veteran's patch and blinking away something behind his glasses. And when she spoke again, it wasn't for the cameras. "It's easy to confuse visibility with value," she said. "But there are thousands of people who aren't on a stage tonight, who don't get a mic or a camera, but they carry this country on their backs. They deliver your mail. They clean the hospitals. They watch your children and pray over graves no one visits anymore. And they are no less American, no less deserving of a voice." Barron tried to insert himself again. His voice had regained some composure, but it lacked resonance. "I agree those people matter, but that's exactly why we need strong economic policies that encourage private enterprise, give people the dignity of work, less government, more growth." It was a line crafted for headlines. It was also a line Jasmine had heard 1,000 times before. She didn't flinch. "Dignity," she repeated, her tone low, her gaze narrowing only slightly. "You think dignity comes from a spreadsheet, from a tax cut that never makes it past the boardroom? Let me tell you where I've seen dignity." She leaned forward, not to loom, but to level. Dignity is a 63-year-old janitor in Dallas who hasn't missed a shift in 22 years and still rides 2 buses to get to work. Dignity is a grandmother raising her daughter's children because the foster system failed them. Dignity is a man who lost both legs in Iraq and still volunteers to mentor boys in his neighborhood so they don't get swallowed by the same streets that took his brother. The audience was no longer watching a debate. They were witnessing testimony. Jasmine wasn't campaigning. She was ministering. "Dignity isn't found in a quarterly report," she said. "It's found in sweat, in sacrifice, in survival." And just as she finished, someone in the back, an older black woman with silver braids, stood up. She didn't say a word. She simply stood. And then, like a slow wave breaking, more followed. Not out of politics, but out of memory, out of pain, out of gratitude. Barron stood stiffly. He saw what was happening, and panic began to set in. Not visibly, not externally, but behind his eyes. The kind of panic that says, "I've lost the room." He tried again. "Let's not forget who we are," he said, grasping at something presidential. "We're Americans. We value resilience, not resentment. We don't dwell on the past. We move forward." Jasmine didn't even blink. "Forward?" she said slowly, her voice almost a whisper now. "You want to move forward, but you haven't turned around to see who's still bleeding. You want to lead, but you haven't asked who's still limping. You talk about the future while ignoring the foundation you've never had to question." She walked one step away from the podium now, hands clasped loosely in front of her. "You want to move forward, Mr. Trump? Then you better learn how to carry the people your privilege walked past." The crowd didn't explode. They leaned in. They listened. They remembered. The moderator sat stunned, his pen frozen mid-sentence. For a brief moment, he looked at Barron, hoping, perhaps, for a counterstrike, a question, anything. But Barron had gone still. His fingers curled at the edge of his podium like they were holding on for balance. Jasmine let the silence stretch. Then gently, she said, "I want to tell you a story." And this time, no one sighed. No one rolled their eyes. No one prepared a rebuttal. The room was ready. "It's about a woman named Danielle," she began, "from just outside Pleasant Grove. Single mother, 2 kids, one with special needs. She worked nights cleaning hospital rooms and spent her days trying to finish her nursing certificate. Then one morning, she was pulled over on her way home from work. Her tags were expired. She didn't argue. She cried. She didn't have the money to renew them. What she didn't know was that it had snowballed into a bench warrant. That's how she found herself sitting in a cell, with her kids at home, scared, waiting, because their mom disappeared without warning. Jasmine paused just long enough for the pain to settle. When I met her, she looked at me and said, "I don't need a savior. I just need someone who sees me." Then she turned toward the audience, not as a speaker, but as a witness. "And that's why I'm here, to see her, to fight for her, to make sure someone who's never heard of this debate still wakes up tomorrow knowing someone in Washington remembers her name." There was no applause. There didn't need to be. The silence spoke louder. And now, Barron's lips parted again. "That's touching," he said, "but we have to make tough choices. Government can't fix everything." Jasmine looked at him with something close to mercy. "You're right," she said. "Government can't fix everything, but it can stop making it worse. It can stop writing bills that sacrifice the poor to protect the comfortable. It can stop pretending that success always comes from effort and failure always comes from laziness. That's a lie. It always was." Barron was unraveling now, reaching for phrases that once drew cheers from boardrooms. "We need less dependency. We need more dignity," Jasmine said, cutting in, not loudly, but cleanly. Barron tried again. "We need accountability." "And we need empathy," she answered. And suddenly, the contrast became unbearable. Not because he was unprepared, but because she had changed the measure. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about passing a mirror. And Barron, he couldn't find his reflection. Jasmine took a breath, then looked toward the ceiling, not as a dramatic gesture, but as if summoning every woman, every man, every child who had carried too much in silence. "I came here to speak, but what I found was a room ready to listen." And the moment she said it, something in the air cracked. The people rose again, not all at once, not with fanfare, but steadily. A slow, swelling recognition, not of her words, but of their weight. The air in the auditorium now held the weight of 1,000 truths. It wasn't the kind of tension that begged for conflict, but the kind that begged for clarity. And Jasmine had given it, over and over again, with the soft-spoken strength of someone who has had to justify her very presence in every room she's ever entered. By now, even the lights seemed to dim in reverence. The cameras had stopped looking for spectacle. They were now capturing something sacred. Barron stood still, fingers no longer gripping the podium, his eyes scanning the room for a single nod of approval he could lean on. But what he saw were arms crossed, hands clasped in laps, chins tilted forward in contemplation. Jasmine hadn't come to burn the stage. She came to baptize it. Barron cleared his throat, but no one responded. His voice was still there, but its power had left him. And then Jasmine took a final step forward, away from her podium, away from the structure of debate, and into something more dangerous, truth without armor. "Some people think debates are about clapping back," she began, her voice low, deliberate. "But real leadership isn't reactive. It's responsive. And I respond to the woman who walks into my office with eviction papers in one hand and her toddler in the other. I respond to the veterans who still wear their old dog tags because the new system forgot their names. I respond to the teachers who spend their salaries on crayons while billion-dollar defense contracts go unchecked. That's who I answer to. Not polls, not pundits, people." And then she looked right at Barron, not with disdain, but with something colder, indifference. "You came here to be seen. I came because I could no longer be silent." There it was, the line, the turning point, the moment when what had been building quietly behind every sentence finally broke through. The crowd didn't cheer immediately. They absorbed it. They felt it crawl under their skin and settle deep. Then came the sound. First a clap, then two. Then the kind of thunder that rises from the soles of people's feet, not from applause, but from knowing, finally, undeniably, that they had witnessed something real. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't step back. She stood still, the way a statue does in the town square, unmoved because she already knows her worth. Barron lowered his eyes. The confidence he had worn so proudly now sat at his feet like a crumpled flag. He glanced at his team, but they offered no rescue. There was none. He had lost, Not in points, not in facts, but in the deeper, quieter contest of conviction. He had prepared for a performance. She had lived a reality. The moderator stood slowly, voice softer than before. "We thank both of our guests," he said, "for their time and service. But I think tonight, we all heard something we weren't expecting." Jasmine didn't move. Not yet. She let the applause fade. Then she turned, not to exit, but to the audience directly. And with the calmness of someone unshaken by power, she said, "This country was not built by the loudest voices in the room. It was built by the ones who kept going when no one was watching. If you are one of them, if you have ever felt invisible, I see you. And I am not done speaking for you." A woman in the audience, a nurse, judging by the badge she had clipped to her sweater, put her hand over her heart. A man in the front row stood, eyes full but hands steady. One by one, the room followed. And Barron, he was already forgotten. Conclusion. The room that wouldn't sit back down hours later, the clips would go viral. Her line, "You came to be seen, I came because I could no longer be silent," would be quoted by pundits, dissected by columnists, and stitched into TikTok videos by teenagers who saw in her something that had been missing in politics for a long time, a soul. But none of that mattered to the people who had been in the room, because they hadn't just heard it. They had felt it. Jasmine exited the stage without flourish. No fist pump, no wave, just a nod to the moderator, a glance at the crowd, and then a walk into the shadows, because she hadn't come to shine. She had come to speak. Backstage, her staff didn't say anything. One aide teared up, but didn't try to hide it. Another simply nodded and whispered, "You said what we needed." And somewhere, in a house not far from that forum, a little girl who had been watching on her grandmother's phone turned to her and asked, "Grandma, can I be like her one day?" Her grandmother, who had worked 3 jobs in her lifetime and buried 2 sons, didn't say yes immediately. She just stared at the screen, then finally replied, "You already are." This wasn't a debate. It was a moment, a recalibration, a reminder that while microphones amplify, it is truth that echoes. And Jasmine Crockett had just made sure her echo would carry for generations. And if you believe the voices of working mothers, veterans, and overlooked communities deserve a podium too, subscribe to this channel. Because what Jasmine reminded us is this: the mic may be shared, but the message must be earned. And she earned every syllable,